Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Strategy International podcast. If this is your first time here, I encourage you to go over our audio platforms, anywhere you get your podcast from, subscribe and review the podcast as well. You can head on over to YouTube as well and subscribe to that page, and you can share that content. We have another amazing guest today on the podcast, Shishir Upadhyaya. Thank you so much, sir, for being on the program.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be on your platform, George.
We appreciate your time, and we know that everyone has a busy schedule. So the fact that you're taking time off that schedule to be with us and to share the knowledge that you have is very much appreciated. We're going to be talking a little bit about something that, at least where I'm from in Canada, we don't get to hear much of in the news. We're going to focus a lot on the Indo-Pacific region. We're going to talk about India. We're going to talk about China, the balance of power in that region, how things have been shifting lately. And it's going to be very interesting. So I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Before we get on to that, though, just for the benefit of everyone listening or watching, you have had quite a lengthy experience as a naval officer in India.
That's right.
How does that whole journey start? This is something interesting to me. How do you make that decision to serve your country? Is that something that is entrenched in the values there in India, or is it a decision that you made?
Well, I always had an interest in the sea, and that's a naval career was quite obvious. So I joined the Navy. In fact, I joined the military academy at the age of about 17. And then I was commissioned into the Navy, by the time I just turned 20. And spent many years at sea, in fact, about over 11 years seagoing experience in my career, including all kinds of ships. I started my career as a midshipman on an aircraft carrier. And then I've served on multiple other ships in the fleet, destroyers, frigates, and I also had the opportunity to sail extensively in the Indo-Pacific region. Mm-hmm. And subsequently, I specialized in naval intelligence. And following my naval career, I transitioned to academia. And I pursued further studies. I did my PhD from the University of Wollongong in Australia, specializing in maritime studies. And so that's been the journey. And I'm now a professor at the American University in the Emirates, teaching at the College of Security Studies.
Tell me a little bit about that experience. Obviously, India, an important naval country. You are the main, I would say, naval force in the Indian Ocean. What were the main challenges that you had to either train for or always be on the lookout? Are we talking about pirates, illegal pirates, or was there anything else about any threat to the naval territories of India?
So good question. See, the Indian Navy is the largest resident naval power in the Indian Ocean region. Of course, the United States is also present in strength, but they're not a resident power per se. And the Indian Navy is probably the fourth largest Navy in the world. And if you read the Indian Maritime Strategy, and the strategy actually articulates, the range of threats that India faces. And that includes the non-traditional threats, like you mentioned, pirates and smuggling and maritime terrorism, which we call as non-traditional threats, up to the entire spectrum of threats. If you look at the one end is the non-traditional threats, and at the other end you have long-term strategic threats of a geopolitical nature, like threat from China, from Pakistan, and other threats like climate change, for example, and the impact it would have on countries in the region. And because India is one of the largest navies, one of the largest economies in the region, and the other countries in the Indian Ocean region are essentially smaller states like Sri Lanka, Maldives in South Asia, Mauritius, Madagascar, which have very limited capacity. So it is the Indian Navy which has now become the key provider of security for the region. And that is also one of the stated objectives or the strategic vision of India, to be the key provider of security for the region. Because India has actually a surplus of security capacity compared to the other smaller states. And you can see that the Indian Navy has participated extensively in providing security, be it in in anti-piracy, in terms of anti-piracy patrols, surveillance in the exclusive economic zone, humanitarian assistance in case of natural disasters. The Indian Navy has deployed its ships all over the region. Recently in Madagascar, there was a cyclone where the Navy had been deployed, and many other occasions like this.
How does that presence, it's interesting that you're mentioning that you've taken on this role of guaranteeing the security in the region because of the advantage that India has as a naval force. How does that bode with respect to the relations, the political relations with some other countries in the region? I'm thinking, for example, of Sri Lanka or other countries where politically, perhaps the relations weren't always at best.
Yeah, so that's also one of the objectives of India's maritime strategy, to establish a favorable environment in the Indian Ocean region or the Indo-Pacific region. And India has, over the years, built very robust bilateral relations with many of the countries. Sri Lanka and Maldives, for example, lie within South Asia, which is the core area of interest for India. And our sphere of influence encompasses not just these countries, but also Bangladesh and Nepal. And therefore, India has been a very important partner for all these countries. And we have fairly robust defense cooperation arrangements with all these countries, also with many countries in Southeast Asia. Then there are other small island states, Mauritius and Seychelles, several countries in Africa, particularly East African countries, and also Middle East. So India, in many ways, has established a network of, defense partnerships or strategic relations anchored on our maritime cooperation, that we have maritime security cooperation. And that has been our strength. And as also, this is something which has been welcomed by other extra-regional powers, including the United States. In fact, the United States has regarded India as a strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific region. And several extra-regional countries, for example, Britain, which has, of course, certain territories in the Indian Ocean region, as also France, have looked up to India as their strategic partner, being the primary maritime power in the region. So this is something which has been welcomed. Yeah.
I want to bounce right off what you just said now about the strategic alliance that you have in general, the relationship that India has with a lot of Western countries. And obviously India being the largest democracy, one would argue that in the region, it's probably the one country that is a lot more aligned to the Western values than any other country in that particular region. And I want to bounce off to something more relative today that many have either been following or a lot more aware, is the conflict in Europe between, the war between Ukraine and Russia. And we saw almost from the beginning how most Western allies took these, this very stringent position on imposing strict measures against Russia. And we saw countries, and we're going to talk about China as well, because it's part of the interest in this discussion, but specifically on India as well, we didn't really see India following into that trend or into those decisions that the Western allies were taking towards Russia. Where are we at this point in time with respect to that conflict and India's position specifically?
Yeah, it's a great question, George. And I think I would see these developments in the larger context of how the world order is evolving. And I believe, and many would agree with me, that we are now in a post-unipolar world, which means America is not the sole superpower anymore. And we are moving towards a multipolar world order where there are going to be multiple power centers, which includes India, China, United States, Russia, and others. Now, when you talk about this conflict, I think this is a question that was asked within days of the conflict having started. Somebody asked the Indian foreign minister about what was India's position, whether it's going to be with the West or is it going to be with Russia. And the foreign minister's response was that who says that there are only two positions? There can also be a third position, and which is our own position. And India sees itself as one of the power centers in the world, and India has always followed a policy of non-alignment or exercising strategic autonomy in framing its foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So therefore, India has very crucial interests. Russia, of course, has been a long-term strategic partner and one of the largest defense suppliers for India for a long time. In fact, until some years ago, 70% of all military equipment in India was of Russian origin. I think currently that's at about 50%. And over the years, we have transitioned to buying more of Western equipment. So Russia has always been a strategic partner for a long time. But that said, India really does not support the conflict because recently at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, Prime Minister Modi had publicly admonished Putin by saying that this is an era of peace and this is not the time for conflict. And likewise, even in the past, when Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, India was still a strategic partner, but the Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi, had actually criticized Soviet actions in Afghanistan. So while India really does not support the conflict, and India has actually provided a lot of support to Ukrainians, of a humanitarian kind, including medical supplies and stuff like that. India has also used this opportunity to buy oil from Russia, mm-hmm. which is something which has been criticized. But then India's position has been that Europe buys lot more oil and gas, even at the time of conflict. Mm-hmm. And therefore, what we are buying, our supplies from Russia were of the order of about 1 or 2% of what we export from the rest of the region. And therefore, this is an opportunity for, in a time of crisis when the large number of countries are entering into a recession, for India to not buy oil from Russia would be against our own national interests.
Well, we see that also with the European countries as well. They haven't stopped because it is in the greater interest of the Europeans not to cut those supplies. I understand that position. I'm curious a lot more though on the relationship with the European and Western allies with respect to this position that India has taken. Has it had any further impact? I mean, is there any pressure you think on making taking a greater stance?
No, I don't think so, because recently we had the Quad Summit, and America appreciates India's position, as also Europe. And India continues to be a strategic partner with the United States and also maintain cordial relations with Russia and many of the European countries. And I think that position is respected because we see that in terms of, if you look at the number of engagements with America, there's been no decline and there's been no impact on India's strategic cooperation with the United States or our cooperation with the European countries. So India has, as always, has followed a policy of non-alignment, which many people would call as multi-alignment, which means to engage, or which the foreign minister has often called as issue-based alignment. So India sees itself as an independent pole in the world order, and it follows its own independent foreign policy, which means it will align with countries on certain issues. So we are aligned with the United States as we are aligned with Europe and also with Russia on certain issues. So that's how India's position is, broadly.
We're gonna circle back to the alliances because I'd really like to pick your brain a little bit on the Indo-Pacific strategy that was just signed, I think, earlier this year in 2022. But before we get there, just as a pretext to that, I want to discuss, the relations in that specific region. When we're talking about the Indo-Pacific region, obviously the countries that come to mind are India and China. They are among the greater powers in that region that kind of control a little bit the balance of power. How are things going in that region? I know there's always been kind of this race to have the greater influence in the region with respect to India and China. How are things there at this point?
So, that's another great question. See, over the last 2-3 decades, we've seen the rise of Chinese political, military, and economic power in the Indo-Pacific region. China is heavily dependent on trade, right? China has a long outstanding territorial dispute with India. And China is a trade-dependent economy. In fact, more than 50% of the GDP comes from trade. And trade is carried by sea. Mm-hmm. And all the sea routes actually pass close to India. So that's a major strategic vulnerability of which China is very conscious. And, since China has an ongoing dispute, a long outstanding territorial dispute with India, they are very conscious of this vulnerability. Because India, being a strategic maritime partner, and India has a huge geostrategic advantage in terms of location in the Indian Ocean region, overlooking the Chinese shipping lanes. So over the years, we've seen that the Chinese have tried to dilute or try to neutralize this advantage by building a stronger presence in the region. So the Chinese, for the first time, in fact, in over a century, they moved to the Indian Ocean on anti-piracy patrols, in 2008 or 2009. And since then, they have not gone back. Mm-hmm. They have actually now created a base in Djibouti, and they're looking at creating bases in other countries in the region, all with the aim of building a larger naval presence. Now, what has happened is that India, being a major economic power in the region, has certain spheres of influence, right? And with the Chinese now coming in, there is obviously a clash of interests. And India is now obviously not going to tolerate. India sees itself, as I said, as a pole in the new world order. And obviously, India will not tolerate any challenges to its sphere of influence. For example, in South Asia, Chinese presence in Sri Lanka and Maldives is something which has been frowned upon by India. And in fact, that is also one of the reasons why these countries are now in a kind of a debt trap with China. China has, if you look at some of the Chinese projects that are going on, the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, that is something which seeks to build, a network of maritime ports and, which could be naval bases in the entire region, right? It is basically an attempt to expand their economic power and political influence. And that indeed really has, heightened the tensions between India and China in the region. So that is something which has been going on, and India and the United States have tried to counter the Chinese influence in the region. And there are, we see new projects being announced, for example, the Blue Dot, which is a project for extending aid, to various countries as an alternate to China. And various other projects that India, Japan, and China are working on, and also the Quadrilateral Initiative, which is another thing in order to balance Chinese influence in the region. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the developments that have been going on.
It's very interesting because we saw almost immediately as Joe Biden was elected in the United States, there was this strategy to shift the attention away from the Middle East into Asia, more specifically on China. So the fact that there's this Indo-Pacific strategy that came out, I don't think it surprises anyone, but for the benefit of everyone listening, can you give us just the main lines of what exactly that is?
Okay. So this actually goes back to 2010, 2011, when Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State under President Obama, first announced a pivot to the East, wherein what she implied was that the US would now move away from the Middle East to focus more on Asia Pacific, because that is where the threat, came from China. And the pivot to the east is what we are seeing now being operationalized. That does not mean that the U.S. interest or presence in the region has been diluted in the Middle East region. It is just that the U.S. is now more focused on Asia Pacific, and of course, now the Asia Pacific strategy has evolved over the years since 2011 when Hillary Clinton first announced this. And today we have something called the quadrilateral security dialogue going on between United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And there's also recently the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States security dialogue, a security arrangement for providing nuclear-propelled submarines to the Australian Navy. So these are developments that we see directly aimed at balancing Chinese influence, which have come about. And I think what has happened is, as I said, over the last 2 decades or so, we've seen an increase in Chinese maritime and political influence. The Chinese Navy has actually, currently it stands, numerically, it is larger than the US Navy. And these changes have happened very recently. In fact, the largest buildup of any naval force seen since the Second World War has been the PLA Navy. And today, the PLA Navy has formidable capabilities in the maritime sphere. And perhaps you could say that the balance of power, could shift in favor of China with a larger Navy. And that's actually a challenge for America. And I think for a long time, the US naval deterrent seemed to have worked, but that increasingly seems to be challenged by a rising China. And in order to balance that, the US strategy seeks to basically balance that. And the quadrilateral dialogue, the Quad, and the AUKUS are, I think, are recent developments which seek to balance Chinese influence.
Do you think there are positive prospects of these initiatives in the region?
Indeed, I think so. For example, as I said, the Chinese are dependent on trade. The greatest vulnerability is the maritime trade, which passes through the Indo-Pacific region, mostly through the Indian Ocean region, going out to Africa. For example, the trade routes from China to Africa pass very close to India, which means if India could actually throttle Chinese trade passing through the Strait of Malacca, which Hu Jintao has called as the former Chinese president called it as China's Malacca dilemma. If somebody could choke Chinese trade through the Malacca Straits, that would actually completely disrupt Chinese economy. And to some extent, China has tried to neutralize India's geostrategic advantage by having a greater presence in the region. But that the vulnerability remains because geography is something which you really can't change. And let me talk about the Quad. The Quad actually, under the Quad, India is also a strategic partner of the United States, and India has access to sophisticated US military platforms. For example, the P-8I maritime reconnaissance aircraft, which is one of the world's most sophisticated maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Now, India has currently about 12, I think. Australia has, I think, an equal number. Japan has over 100 such aircraft. And therefore, all these aircraft can actually cover the Indo-Pacific region virtually, track every ship in the region, which gives us huge, in terms of maritime surveillance, a huge advantage over China. And then you've got, under the AUKUS, you've got Australia getting new nuclear propelled submarines. Which again kind of tilt the balance of power in the favor of the West or of the United States. So if you look at technologically, the quadrilateral and the AUKUS have kind of, these are kind of deter Chinese maritime ambitions in the region. Because the maritime patrol aircraft provides you complete coverage of the region, and you got the ability to carry out targeting of vessels of interest, which means effectively the PLA Navy is quite powerless in the region if all the four regional countries were to join hands.
How is China reacting to these collaborations, these cooperations between all the Western allies in the region?
Yes. So initially, China was quite skeptical, and the Chinese foreign minister, I think, or the defense minister, is known to have once said that the Quad was like the sea foam, which will disperse with really has no substance. But I think Chinese now increasingly view these developments with a great deal of concern, because it's now clear that the Quad and the AUKUS provide, tremendous surveillance capacity and the ability to target vessels of interest in the region, which is very difficult for the Chinese to counter, really. And therefore, China is obviously not happy with these developments. And China has actually now, the biggest worry for China is that if other countries in the region want to bandwagon with the Quad, in the sense that if they were to join hands with India, United States, Japan, and Australia, for example, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, these are countries which have issues with China. And if they were to strengthen the Quad, then it would be very difficult for China to project its power in the region. So, yeah.
Has there been any tangible impact that you've seen already in its export routes and in its attempt to carry forward in its business?
Well, China continues to strengthen its position in the Indo-Pacific region. They have strengthened the base at Djibouti. They're also looking at bases in, I believe, in other regions in the Horn of Africa. I think in Eritrea, possibly. Gwadar in Pakistan is where they have huge economic interests, huge investments, is another potential area where they could have a base that could greatly counter India's geostrategic advantage. So these are developments that we see. And but currently, I think the balance of power stands in favor of the United States, because helped by the Quad and the AUKUS in great measure.
Is there a growing, because I'm asking you this question because obviously the media that we listen to over here, there's some bias, perhaps the reality on that side of the planet is different, but there's growing concern about North Korea in America. Yesterday, I think, or before yesterday, we saw that they launched a rocket over Japan. So that kind of raised the alarm levels. And we've known traditionally that China has usually supported North Korea. How is that whole reality over there, and how's that playing into the regional politics?
Well, this is nothing new. North Korea has done that in the past, and they continue to do so. And you're right, North Korea is an ally of the Chinese, and China has always supported them, though I would say that perhaps the Chinese may not always encourage them to do such things, because in many ways, I think the North Korean leadership do their own thing. And I think we've seen a pattern. Every now and then the North Koreans will carry out maybe a missile launch or something into over Japan or into the waters, just to up the ante. And but really nothing much has come out of it. But that continues to be a challenge. Yes, indeed. But that's, as I said, the US pivot to the Asia Pacific, and which has now been operationalized through the Quad and the AUKUS. I think these are all designed to deal with such challenges that would come up in the future.
Tell me, I don't want to take up a lot of your time, Shishir, but tell me a little bit, in the coming years, in the next maybe 5 to 10 years, how do you see this shift happening in the region?
You mean in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yes.
I think currently we see the Quad and the AUKUS are very recent developments. The AUKUS was announced only last year, and it is yet to be operationalized in the sense that Australia is still to acquire those submarines. But there's also there are other developments in the offing. For example, there's also talk of a joint partnership for hypersonic missiles to be fitted on the submarines, and also for the Boeing aircraft. Now, these are major developments, and I think in the coming years, we will see greater military engagement between these four democratic countries: United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And with that, I think that's going to be more trouble for China, really. As also we see the Belt and Road Initiative, which started off, with a bang, but with many countries now entering into a debt trap, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and many countries entering into recession, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative is probably going to suffer in the short term. So I think if you look at a 5-year horizon, I think we will see greater military cooperation between United States, India, which will help to kind of counter Chinese influence that we've seen growing over the last 2 decades.
Interesting. If we can leave something to the listeners or to the viewers, especially in the region, is there anything, any book or any publication or anything either that you've read or that you've written that you highly recommend for anyone to maybe increase their knowledge on the matters developing in that region?
Well, I think the latest US Indo-Pacific Strategy is a very useful document, which is actually a very slim book, maybe about 30-40 pages, and it's available online. I would highly recommend that for those who are interested in who have been tracking these developments in the Indo-Pacific region. That's one book. And I would also take this opportunity to recommend my own book on the subject, the India's Maritime Strategy. That's also available through Routledge. So these are two publications, I think, which will give you a broad overview of what's going on and what's likely to happen over the next 5 to 10 years.
Very interesting. Shishir, again, I want to thank you for your time. You've brought a lot of value, I believe, to the listeners, to the viewers of Strategy International podcast. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, George. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, everyone, for following. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again on the next episode. Take care.